To share the industry perspective and the way forward for DIB contractors, Steve Shirley, the Executive Director of the National Defense Information Sharing and Analysis Center and Vice Chair of the Defense Industrial Base Sector Coordinating Council, joins us for an interview session. Before ND-ISAC as Executive Director of the Defense Cybercrime Center, Steve led the development and operation of the DOD's Principal Cyber Threat Sharing Program with defense contractors and its Vulnerability Disclosure Program. For decades, he has been a leader in efforts to protect the DIB members' operations, technologies, and partners from foreign adversaries and criminal threats. Thanks for being with us today, Steve.
Great. Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. I will say it was a great introduction, and at the risk, though, of embarrassing Steve here, there's many patriots here today at CMMC Con and who've generously donated their time to spend with us, but I'd put Steve very high on that list, and we're going to get into some of the why on that today. And many people may not know Steve Shirley, and Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. But really, Steve, you have a fascinating background and a truly unique set of experiences, particularly your time as Executive Director of Defense Cybercrime Center, and having been there when you led DC3 at a time when the Defense Industrial Base was really just beginning to be compelled to wake up and address the cybersecurity threat on their unclassified networks. And I remember when 2008 Deputy Secretary of Defense Gordon England directed the DOD to essentially stop the bleeding and establish a cyber threat sharing partnership between the Department of Defense and the Defense Industrial Base. And you, under your leadership, DC3, almost overnight, I mean, I just can't, I really can't convey the speed at which you and your team kind of created something from the outside looking in, really from nothing, and created incident sharing and incident reporting products for those of us on the other side as your customers in the DIB and that cybersecurity pilot program at the time to use. And so, from my perspective, what you did with the resources you had at the time was just remarkable. I'd love to hear just from your perspective, because I really do think it was pretty historical. What do you remember most from that time?
Well, thanks, Eric, and thanks for the very kind intro. And the description about the spin up of DC3. A pretty remarkable set of conversations preceded that in terms of the interface with industry partners. It was some of them, I guess, in diplomatic speak, would have been described as quite spirited, and they needed to be. You know, coming into that, many of the folks in industry said, "Okay, government guys, when you say share, here's what we hear. Tell us everything you know, and we'll call you if we have questions." And so, one of the things that we believed that we had to do on the DC3 side was one, iterate through those issues in a way to build products that were responsive to industry as defined by industry requirements, and not just what government guys thought industry folks would want to see. And so we went through a pretty lengthy process there to make sure that we could get it as close to right as a start as we could. The other thing we thought that was important was defining and operating for a government entity and build products at the speed of need, if you will, defined by industry folks, defined by the companies who subscribe to the initial program. And so I don't know if we got it right, but we worked really hard to do that. And the other thing that really enabled that is that we had a really remarkable industry government team within ND-ISAC, and so there was the ability to focus on ways and pull talent in a way that might not have been quite as easy in other places in the Department of Defense. So the people who really defined the success, I think, were the companies who were the signatories to the DOD's DIB cybersecurity program at the time, and so to the extent it aided their progress, we took that as a highly positive thing. You know, feedback is just devilishly hard to suss out, and there was and we got a lot of signals from DOD in terms of tell us how you think this is affecting industry, and on a positive side or pro or con for that matter. But at one remarkable setting, one of our industry colleagues invited us out and said, "Look, working with you and your team has made us a materially better company worldwide." And then, so I sort of sat back in the chair and wow. So tell me why you say that. And then they were kind enough to take us through a series of performance measures that were really compelling. That was a pretty great thing to hear. Really ratified for us and the team that we were at least tracking in generally the right direction.
Steve, there's a lot in what you said there, and one of the things that I think, and I remember vividly, comes through is you really did, and I think this is what was so meaningful from the folks at DC3. You treated industry as a customer, and you really did take feedback. And you used to say all the time, and I use it now, and I stole it, from you, is there's 0% chance we get it 100% right. And you were just there was a humility that I think was foundationally at the center of all the progress that was made, because it was, there was a lot of opportunity for an adversarial relationship between DOD and industry, right? The DOD was asking, as you said, right? You feed me a bunch of information, I'll tell you if I need more, and that's it. It was kind of a black box potentially. And I think your team did an amazing job of taking a customer-focused approach. And I think that was the foundation of all the progress that was made. And I remember that time well as the CISO for a large aerospace and defense contractor at the time. And in some ways, many ways, I felt like your customer. You made us feel that way, and you iterated the product in a way that we were a customer. And I remember going from FedEx delivered threat information products to unclassified and then classified electronic products in relatively short order. I mean, it really, the speed at which everything moved, you always want it faster, right? But it was amazing. And here we are 15 years later. How do you think that public-private partnership between DOD and the Defense Industrial Base is performing?
That could probably be the subject of a 3-day symposium, I suppose. But I think it is light years better than it was in 2007 or 8. There are things that can be tabled and worked through today that I think in 2007 or 8 our industry partners would have run screaming from the room. And it's not that DOD or other federal entities and industry will always agree about the issue, but I think there is the preparation of that discussion space that had to take place to be able to get to this to the point we are today, which is not ideal, but it's better than it was. One of my old teammates used to say, "You can be wrong if you're right too soon." And there were a couple of things that were tabled in 2009-ish or so. There were maybe the right thing to do from a technical standpoint, but from the standpoint of the industry government culture or the relationship that created that culture, we just couldn't put that ball, whatever it was, in the end zone, so to speak. Now I think there's a much higher probability of those things, and in many cases can be operationalized. And I think it's owing to having plowed that ground, some of which was pretty rocky at the time.
Yeah, there was some rocky ground. And I mean, you alluded a little bit to, the having to work through all the different politics and bureaucracy on the industry side, as well as the government side. And a lot of progress has been made. I mean, I am optimistic in this area. And I think the government seems to be making and promoting meaningful and I think potentially impactful regulation to drive private sector investment in cybersecurity across every sector of the economy, the SEC, TSA, DOD. I mean, every agency in community is looking at the legislative way to kind of force change maybe faster. And so the proposals run the gamut across every sector. They include legislating incident reporting, information sharing, mandatory minimum cybersecurity standards. And for me, many of all, if not all of these things, the DOD and DIB, public-private partnership, largely worked out a decade ago. They didn't solve everything, and I like that idea that maybe some things were right too soon and therefore wrong. But so much good work was done and so much ground plowed, as you said. Do you think the lessons learned by DOD and the DIB, and what I think is one of the strongest public-private partnerships, are being shared and leveraged, or are we reinventing the wheel in some cases?
That's a really a good question. And I think there's some complexities to it. So there's some artifacts of bureaucracy that are interesting in the Department of Defense, but I think they also apply to industry in terms of a person having to do with knowledge transfer, personnel turnover, and so forth. You know, I sometimes think of a generation within the Department of Defense or the military services as framed around the transfer, personnel transfer cycle, of the permanent change of station process, as it's known in the military, and transferring that knowledge to the successor generation becomes something of a challenge, and it occurs, of course, on the federal agency side as well. And so you get this, rather than this absolute accretion of knowledge and forward progress, in some cases it's incremental, and from time to time, I think we absolutely, you can make a case that we engage in these voyages of rediscovery on major points. You recall, and I'm sure many of the audience will, the national NSPD 54, National Security Policy Directive 54, promulgated in the second Bush administration, and it was titled at the same time Homeland Security Policy Directive 23, and Melissa Hathaway led that process, and it was 12 or 6 major initiatives, as I recall, and 12 enablers, and one of those had to do with, connect the federal cyber centers. And if memory serves, right now, there's a revision process of Presidential Policy Directive 21 underway, and part of the supporting instruments that have been published recently and connected with that, like the implementation plan, call for looking at the federal cyber centers. But again, and so there may be compelling and cogent reasons for that, but at a remove, one kind of wonders, is the progress absolutely linear? And I think the answer is maybe not. And so, but the thing that should concern us all is that while we're doing that, and part of that effect is also owing to the nature of our democracy, the nature of the private sector owning, a significant proportion of the critical infrastructure, the exchanges of views between the federal agencies and the respective regulators, and the other guys have a much different process that I don't think we would want to live in, certainly, but it makes one wonder if they aren't moving the ball in a much more consistent fashion vis-a-vis our ability to defend against their offensive efforts. So it's I think that was a concern beginning in 2004 in the Titan Rain era that you recall, and it continues today in a very aggressive manner on the part of the opposition team.
Yeah, Steve, there's, again, I always pick up optimism and kind of the way you take such a strategic view on things. And when you talked about the that turnover, PCS, and permanent change of station, and kind of how do we maintain that institutional knowledge. One of the things that encourages me is folks like you. You're in a different role now. We're going to talk about your role at ND-ISAC here in a minute, but and then we have folks at the White House level. Probably less continuity within the DOD, at least from the folks that I knew way back in 2008 and who's still kind of involved today. So it's actually, I find it very encouraging. Some of the folks who are still involved and have moved up in their careers and are still kind of part of that ecosystem, either at the White House, the intelligence community, somewhat in the DOD. That continuity is so important. I think a negative or a pessimistic view would say, we aren't leveraging all those lessons and passing them down. But some of it is just the reality, as you said, of like people move on and PCS and other things and the nature of the way the system's set up. It's hard to maintain that continuity. So it's less that we're maybe reinventing the wheel. Maybe we're just not as good as kind of making sure those lessons are passed down. I think that's an encouraging and thoughtful way to put it.
Yeah. And that's not to say that you want the same person in the same seat forever. That's not healthy either. So the successor generation may bring in extraordinarily bright people that have different ideas to say that thing that almost worked, let's turn it this way and try and implement it. So there are upside features, but if you've been around long enough to look in the rearview mirror, you do see some things that look somewhat familiar.
Yeah, well, speaking of the rearview mirror, 10 years ago, we didn't have the acronym CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which is why much of the audience is here today. We had really a voluntary set of NIST controls. As I remember, it was like 53 sub-controls or 56 maybe from NIST 800, 53. That eventually evolved into DFAR 7012 and NIST 800-171. And essentially, the requirements have stayed the same for the last 8 years or so. Like I always kind of remind anybody who's hyperventilating about the constant change of requirements. Actually, if you step back, it's really the same requirements. And they've been law for at least 8 years now, depending on when you start counting. And so really, we should have a highly secure defense industrial base that shares threat information broadly, reports cybersecurity incidents within 72 hours, because that's the law today. What do you think the reality is? Where are we really?
So I think the reality turns out to be something a bit different. So DFARS 252.204-7012, and it actually took about 5 years for the Department of Defense to promulgate that. And so on 31 December 2017, it made mandatory those controls that are referred to, about 110 by most counts, borrowed from NIST Special Pub 800-171. I think the larger companies in the Department of Defense are arguably leaders in industry in America today and how they understand the threats from nation states and other cybersecurity aggressors. But as you move down the supply chains, it becomes, I think, a more challenging circumstance for smaller companies to look across that. Understand that, look across that, and then make a decision. How are we going to do that? At the same time, we're concerned most immediately with pushing product to our customer, the prime, making payroll, and identifying and keeping skilled people to do 1 and 2, and then, oh, by the way, how do we do these other things? I think there are within the SMBs some many leaders who look across that, say it may not be convenient for us, but we absolutely are going to have to come to terms with that if we want to remain as defense contractors. But elsewhere, I think there are still companies that I'll call have adopted the strategy of whistling past the graveyard, so to speak. And I think it will be a splash of water at the point where they really do realize that to be a contractor to the Department of Defense, they're going to have to step up to the requirements of CMMC that apply to them, and prepare to undergo the assessment process. So I think it will be, for a period of time, a mixed picture.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I talked to Brian Krebs, the, I guess, investigative journalist last year, and he used a term that I love, is that, I don't know that he specifically termed it to the defense industrial base, but he said, because of the regulatory enforcement around cybersecurity, there's a lot of forced curiosity around what should be done relative to cybersecurity. And then I think there is another group that just says, and I've heard it, I'm not going to do anything until the cyber police show up in the terms of regulatory or assessment, and that's that whistling past the graveyard. So given that kind of backdrop, what do you think the most impactful set of actions because everyone who's part of this defense industrial base, could take to move the DIB forward in cybersecurity?
So I think most reasonable folks in industry see an important role for thoughtful, what I'll call well-modulated regulation. One of the things that I think many folks in industry are concerned about is the increasing, some people would term avalanche of regulation and legislative proposals to do X within industry. And I think all of those are well-intentioned, but as you know, based on your current position and former role as a CISO, there's cybersecurity expertise is not infinitely elastic, either in industry or in government, and the ability for companies to look across that proliferation of different requirements becomes a very taxing process. One of the things we have within the National Defense ISAC are a couple of dozen technical working groups, and only a couple of which are concerned with policy issues. And the one that predominates there, won't surprise you, is concerned with CMMC. And one of the things that just is a striking observation to me is the enormous attention and range of questions about all the participating subject matter experts from 140 some odd companies, is how much time they spend going through, does this requirement promulgated by A equal this requirement promulgated by B, equaling this or that requirement promulgated by C. And so I've begun to think it's not a matter that we need more cybersecurity legislation or regulatory initiatives. It would be an enormous boon to industry if the federal government would create the Rosetta Stone of requirements and say, here's how these compare to each other, and this control gets reciprocal credit from agency A, B, C, D, and E, and so forth. That would save just a huge amount of effort on the part within industry, and cost within industry. But more from a more compelling standpoint, there's an opportunity cost to all of that attention to try and understand, do all of these things equal? That the opportunity cost is that attention could be more useful, plowed into actually focusing on the cybersecurity implementation issues, or chasing or trying to identify anomalies that may present within the network infrastructure.
It's an amazing point, Steve, right? Like, there's so much energy being spent studying the problem instead of implementing a solution. And I think that one of the things about CMMC is, I believe, that, implementing the solution of essentially NIST 800, 171, 110 controls by most people's count, as you said, actually makes you more secure. Because if you're not doing a lot of those things, you're less secure. And so I think that the time spent implementing the solution would be so much more valuable than talking about, page 56, paragraph 4, subparagraph 2, bullet point 4. I mean, that kind of, I kind of say sometimes it's like an umpire convention where everybody's getting together to discuss the infield fly rule. Nobody's playing baseball. And so I'd love to see more time spent on the solution. On that front, you mentioned ND-ISAC, and today you're the executive director of, for those who don't know the acronym, the National Defense Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And so for anyone in the audience that isn't familiar with ND-ISAC, because I think ND-ISAC has a very important role focusing on the solution, how do you serve defense sector organizations, suppliers, contractors, et cetera?
Well, thanks, Eric, for a chance to pitch you with a little infomercial here. But we're a nonprofit organization formed by and for the member companies. ISACs are really a creation that are encouraged by the policies promulgated by the federal government to encourage improvements in critical infrastructure. And so ND-ISAC, the way that we approach that is through trying to move the ball on 5 lines of effort. Not surprisingly, trusted sharing between and among the member companies within a secure portal, where company A may say, I see this, do you see that? And then the peer subject matter experts can iterate on how to defend against it. Second line of effort, I mentioned a moment ago, we have I think a really remarkable set of technical working groups. They're led by member company subject matter experts in a particular issue. And then from the staff, the team side, we support the knowledge management, curating the notes and putting on the hosting the webinars and so forth. And speaking of knowledge management, we also do what I'll call a small conference or technical exchanges, typically between cyber threat analysts, security engineers, and once a year we do one for the execs to really tell us whether our compass heading is the right way. And then increasingly, we're trying to develop a menu of capabilities for smaller companies, knowing that they don't have either the capabilities or buying power that a larger company may be able to achieve. And so can we help in that regard? And the last line of effort is that we're a second hat and a related but differently chartered entity called the Defense Industrial Base Sector Coordinating Council. And I'm the vice chair there. That again, and that entity is another body that's encouraged by those federal policies that I talked about. But so that's one. I think a terrific organization, certainly in terms of helping those companies elevate their cybersecurity. But beyond something I should add, I think that's important, about 2/3 of the members are the traditional defense contractors that most people would recognize. Company A, they're in defense. But we also have about 1/3 who have lines of business with the Department of Defense, but much larger footprints in another sector, in the energy sector, pharma, comms, IT, and finance, for example. And so, as you know, nation state threat actors tailor their tools at different targets. And so I think that range of companies allows us to maybe suss out and understand threats that are emerging in different places that becomes a real benefit to the members. So.
Yeah, and it's a worthy commercial to give. Sincerely, Steve. I mean, one of the things I appreciate about ND-ISAC is I'm simple, so I'll put it in terms of good guys and bad guys. It's staffed with good guys, right? Like folks, men and women who've been in roles within industry, or like Steve, in roles within government. And so the continuity we talked about earlier, and kind of the ability to pass down lessons learned and kind of continue to make forward progress, is deeply embedded, I think, in the leadership ranks of ND-ISAC. And yet, without naming names, you have folks who've been in global CISO roles at large organizations. And so they know the problem from that side, and also from the supply chain side, because they had a large supply chain that they had to help manage and deal with and secure. And so I just think there's an incredible wealth of experience that is so useful at ND-ISAC. And I think it'd be useful, Steve, to help our audience understand who's eligible for membership and what's the best way for them to get in touch to learn more about ND-ISAC.
Well, thank you, Eric. The best way is to contact info@ndisac.org. But we also have a website that's www.ndisac.org. But first of all, we're oriented toward companies that are contractors to the Department of Defense, but also importantly, companies with whom those contractors have key interdependencies. And so that covers a pretty broad range when you think about the Department of Defense buys everything from bootlaces to warships to fifth generation fighters, right? And so there's a fair amount of elasticity and looking at those interdependencies. For example, we have several members who are very large energy producers and distributors. Now, they obviously have a much larger footprint within the energy sector, but oh, by the way, they also support a range of military installation or defense installations. And so if there's a contract there that affects from the Department of Defense, there's a nexus to the CMMC, right? And so I think those sorts of folks find a lot of value in understanding our understanding about and focus and affinities with the Department of Defense. And so for anyone out there who wants to chat about that, please tag us at info@ndisac.org. We'd love to talk to you, and obviously no obligation there, but we're at anyone's convenience to go through that with them.
Yeah, and I'd encourage the audience to do that. It really is, it's an endorsement I give, wholeheartedly. And you touched on this, Steve, in your answer. There is just the breadth of the DOD supply chain and how deep and wide it is, and how 6 degrees of separation to CMMC. And so when you get past the major prime contractors, though, whose names we all know and recognize, the cybersecurity budgets get pretty lean. And so for a small business that has to prioritize their investment, and they also have this regulatory, some might say cloud looming over them, where do you think they should start?
Well, another super question. First of all, every company doing business or considering doing business with the Department of Defense needs to become basically familiar with the cyber maturity model certification as it's currently proposed. And you've been in Eric, in a huge range of industry fora, and there are some members of that audience who will say, geez, I think I've heard of CMMC. What is that again? And so if those folks want to do business with the department, they need to begin looking at that right now and understanding how that may devolve on their business. And so for the smaller companies, one way to, and I think one of the ways that beyond the self-study that they should do as a small business owner or CEO of a small mid is undertake that study on their own, but also in any complicated project, or it's nice to have battle buddies, right? Or partners who are not gonna pitch you on something that's not good for you. And I think that's one of the values of ND-ISAC, is that they're among peers who are going through the same thing, and they get the collective benefit of that knowledge base, and saying, no, that's not how that requirement is going to work. It's going to work like this because we consulted the following, X number of subject matter experts. So we have high confidence it'll look like X, not Y. And so that allows those companies to make and allocate those scarce dollars with more precision, I think, than they would otherwise be able to do.
Yeah, it's a great point, because there's like it or not, some of this can be very subjective, overlapping, conflicting. And so having a battle buddy is a great concept. I always encourage people, when you're talking to anybody in the industry, vendors, partners, et cetera, if you're going to kind of engage in a relationship, get a reference, reach out and talk to someone they've done it for, and make sure, the outcomes were ones that you'd want to have. And references, I think, are pretty important, although underutilized. In kind of along that line of the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think you've kind of seen it all probably in this space from the different perches you've held over time. And so for the companies that are getting cybersecurity right, what do you think they're doing that sets them apart? Is it all about spending and resources? Is there another common denominator, or how do you look at that for the folks who are getting it right?
This will sound trite, but I also think there's some truth in it. Whether you're running a lemonade stand or whether you're running a Fortune 500 company, the chief executive of the organization sets the tone for the organization in terms of signing, this is important to us, we need to get this right in preference to these other things. And so you're spot on. It isn't always about dollars, although clearly the companies that have access to more resources have a far greater range of options. But going back to those smaller companies we talked about a moment before, the ones who I think are really have a much better probability and who are really impressive in terms of the way they're going about it are ones where their president, CEO, or business owner has said, this is important to us and we've got to get it right, even if it's painful for us right now. And so they're allocating time, and they're finding, to the extent they can, dollars within their budgets to be able to get smart. And one of the things, again, that they're challenged with, to go back to comments a moment ago, is that you can type CMMC in your browser and it'll explode, right? and so finding that trusted reference about how should I spend my dollars. I don't have very many. I'm trying to stay in business. I've got a supplier issue, or I've got a finishing house issue, and geez, what is this CUI concept, and how DOD will insist that I manage that? What does that mean to me? And so within an organization like ND-ISAC, you get those at least trusted references and peers who will say, here's how we think this will look, and how we are going to approach it. And so
Steve, I just apologize. I didn't want to interrupt your flow there. You said something, though, that just struck me. It resonates with my experience, that kind of having that executive support, and then figuring out how you're going to allocate the resources. But it starts with the executive support, as you said. And in my experience, whatever it was now, 12 years or so ago, as a global CISO aerospace and defense company, the only reason I had any level of success with our team and working with your team at DC3 and the DOD is because our board got it. They leaned into the requirement, and whether it's a board at a global company or a CEO at a tool and die manufacturer in Iowa, whoever is kind of in charge, I had the blessing and it really was a blessing of a board who heard what their largest customer, the Department of Defense, was saying, and then listened, leaned into the requirement, and took it as and I remember these are the words we used frequently, was it's our role as just being a good citizen and a good supplier to our largest customer to be fully engaged in this effort. And all the progress that we were able to make stemmed completely and fundamentally from that executive support. And we actually have a download here today in the venue. I forget the title of it, but if you can't find it, reach out. But it's a completely vendor agnostic kind of how to win support from your leadership team and your executive, whether it's a board, CEO, senior leadership team, whatever it is, how to frame the issue of cybersecurity to go, and as you described, Steve, and try and secure those precious resources to do what you can in a priority order. I think that is the number one key to success. I don't think it's trite at all. I think it's true. It's just that is the absolute precursor to any success in cybersecurity, I think.
You put your finger there, Eric, on something that one of the things that has changed over the last 15 years or so. You know, you could go to a conference, cybersecurity conference in 2009 or so, and you'd see some poor soul sitting at the end of the bar. You know, you'd walk up to them, they'd flinch, and you'd say, "What do you do?" And they say, "Well, I'm the CISO. What's going on with you?" Well, you know, those other guys hate me. I'm a cost center, right? You know, and so that has the positioning and import of the role has become radically different in the last few years in terms of where many of those are positioned in the larger corporations, and the appreciation of the issues by the CEO, by the boards. So that's been a very important change, I think.
Yeah, and I think part of that change, and you kind of triggered another memory. I remember an executive who said to me once when I was a CISO, I kind of said, "Hey, how can we kind of enable the business and kind of making the rounds, and what can we do to kind of be a good partner with the business?" And he was a brilliant guy, great mentor. And he thought for a minute and he said, and this was, I think, you know, the CISO at the end of the bar days back then. And it was, he said, "You know, I'm not sure how you can enable me. I know how you can hurt me. And that's to drive up cost." And that was the discussion back then. That definitely evolved. And I think it evolved in many ways because I think there's a greater understanding both of the regulatory threat to businesses, but also the less, I think maybe in this audience, potentially everyone understands the threat from Russia, China that others represent. But as I said earlier, you had a very unique perch relative to that threat for your many years at DC3 and now in your role as the executive director of ND-ISAC. Can you help our audience understand how real and prevalent the threat is, and beyond winning a contract, what's really at stake here?
So I'm not the first one to make this observation, and many in the audience will have undoubtedly done it too, but it's not by accident that Chinese aircraft and warships look a lot like American aircraft and warships. And so certainly since 2004, when you and others began to put your finger on activities that were then described as Titan Rain, those things have only escalated in terms of their persistence and the energy that other countries have applied to pirating, I'll call it, the very hard work plowed into and dollars plowed into by companies into research and development. You know, those things we have as a nation believe have afforded us an advantage and a differentiator vis-a-vis our opponents, but that's eroded pretty dramatically. And so, you know, sort of distilling that down to Company X, you know, if a nation state actor, and the Chinese get credit for deservedly in this, pirates your key intellectual property that you spent a ton of money, time, and dollars into developing, and they take that R&D and operationalize it within a dirt cheap production infrastructure and ship it back to the United States in bazillions of Sealand containers and put it on the shelf for $5 a unit cheaper. You're out of business. You're done. So that's the now that for some folks appears sort of this yeah, I've read about that, but I'm not sure that affects me. Believe me, it affects you. If you're in anything related to the defense business or any technology business, if you're in food and ag for that matter, it affects you. And so it's I know there are a range of things that when you crack open a newspaper today or look at it online, you go, oh gosh, where to start in terms of the worry point. But that one, if you're running a business, ought to be pretty high on your among your worry points.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Right, there is a long list of things to worry about, but this should be right there, I think, at the top. And one of the things I greatly appreciate about the industry is that, I think we've moved from mostly fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and that was really driven by marketing and vendors and selling that. I think there's a much more thoughtful conversation that happens now. I think companies are smarter, more sophisticated about kind of how they buy, and they're not compelled. And so I think the conversations being more driven by facts and figures relative to the threat, rather than just that kind of sky is falling. And I am hopeful that will help us drive meaningful change over time. You've been very generous with your time, Stephen. I want to ask you a final question, and just get your perspective, on cybersecurity in the U.S. It's very much feels like it's dependent on a mix of politics, technology, and the will to act, ultimately. And are you optimistic about the future of this space, or how do you view it?
I think you have to come to it with a sense of optimism that the right person, the right team, the right ideas can always make a difference. I think if you go into it with the default setting that the other team is so well resourced, is so competent, they're going to clean our clock no matter what play we run on the field. Yeah, you've guaranteed, you've predicted the outcome there. So I don't think anyone would say we have reached, sort of the optimal, and in terms of the confluence of all these complex things that we need to get right within the United States. Not nearly. But I think you have to approach that challenge with a sense of optimism that if we do these things that we've talked about, there is a chance for us to not just come to a draw, but to prevail in the ball game, so to speak. I think every successful teacher, coach, CEO, military commander leads their people with a sense of optimism. I think that's got to happen with this challenge as well.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to phrase it, Steve. Reminds me of the saying, if you think you can't, you're right. And if you think you can, you're also right. And I believe that. We have a couple thousand people attending this event today, and I hope they take away from your words and the sessions here today a sense of optimism, because this is the greatest country in the world, and it's ours to kind of help defend and move the ball forward. And we don't, there's 0% chance we get it 100% right every time, but we are getting it, I think, more right than wrong. And Steve Shirley, Executive Director of the National Defense Information Sharing and Analysis Center, I want to thank you greatly for your time today. I think this is an incredible session for our audience. So thanks again for your time.
Well, Eric, thank you so much. And we should both give credit to General John Jumper, former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, from whom I cribbed that.
All right.
So
I didn't know that.
Great guy. Yeah.
I appreciate you passing that down, and I'll remember to cite that source. That's great.
Okay.
Thanks again,
Thanks
Steve.
so much.
Thank you, Steve, for giving our audience greater insight into the history that has led to the government's development of CMMC 2.0 and what contractors can do to ensure they have the appropriate security posture.